there, we are the Margin Medics. My name is Juan.
And my name is Esteban.
And we are today bringing you the first part of a series all about unit economics. Let's call it a video clinic. And what is this exactly? Me and Esteban have seen again and again that founders and operators are screwing up and they're not flying with the correct map. My experience in the last 2 years has been working at a venture accelerator, working with hundreds of founders. Esteban's experience has been as head of finance and CFO at multiple startups pre-Series A and post-Series A. And again, we see this problem with unit economics. Esteban and I met in 2012 at a venture-backed company called Washio. It was an Uber for laundry and dry cleaning delivery. And that's when I first learned about unit economics thanks to Esteban, who was the head of finance. And like I said before, the last X amount of years, me and Esteban have seen this problem again and again. And we just wanted to create the best possible online resource for founders and operators to understand unit economics and really be able to implement analysis within their own organization to better guide and lead their strategy and business.
Well said, Juan. Yeah. Basically, as Juan indicated, I've been in a finance role at a few different startups, and time again, I've run into this situation where you see that the operators don't have a firm grasp on these concepts. And Juan and I have essentially become evangelists of this notion amongst our friends, colleagues, and today we're trying to bring that to anybody that wants to learn about it in the form of this video clinic. And I think today we're going to start with what we want to call a simple unit economics introduction. So it's going to be a few finance terms, a few things about understanding a business, but let's get right down to that. So we're going to be looking at a brief introduction on unit economics. And so the little chart on the right, this we pulled directly out of Yahoo Finance. This is actually Uber's P&L for the last 2 quarters ending in 2019, right? And this is the traditional P&L, and it's really has a gross profit focus, right? As you can see here, they have their total revenues, they subtract the cost of revenues, and they end at gross profit, right? So this is the same thing that we're highlighting over here, right? The revenues, which are your gross revenues less any discount sales, we call those contra revenues, and then the direct cost of sales. So that's the gross profit focus that the traditional P&L has. And you'll often hear this term called the line, right? Where do you draw the line? So this line that I've drawn here, I've drawn it right below gross profit, above what's called operating expenses, right? And below this line, you can see the operating expenses such as costs not directly associated to the sales, both fixed and variable. And once you subtract the operating expenses from your gross profit, that's where you get to your operating income. Again, this is a traditional P&L, gross profit focus. Most people running a business have seen this. What we're going to talk about is the operator's P&L, which is contribution margin focus. So you might notice that we took out these variable indirect costs that were previously below the line, and now we've moved them up above the line, right? So this is when you may hear the terminology, well, you should probably put those costs above the line, not below the line, right? That's what this line is. And as you see now, we've now come up with a new concept called contribution margin that we really want everyone that's listening to this to focus on, right? And contribution margin is the gross profit that the financial P&L operator was looking at, less these variable indirect costs. Now we've brought above the line, right? So the real key P&L terms to really take away here are COGS, cost of goods sold. This is what we call the direct cost of sales. Gross profit, which is what you get after you've subtracted out these direct costs of sales from your revenues. Variable indirect costs. These are the costs that are not directly associated with the sales, but they indirectly are associated. And then contribution margin, right? What you actually are making after you've taken into account these variable indirect costs. And some of the jargon that we mentioned We said above, below the line. Another term you're going to hear us talk about, and we'll say a lot, is fully loaded. Right? Are those costs fully loaded? And what we mean by fully loaded is are all of the costs, every single thing associated with your revenue generation, really above the line? That would be fully loaded. Right? So what are unit economics, right? Because right now all we talked about was the P&L, a pretty regular finance thing, and now that operators P&L down to contribution margin, right? Well, unit economics are measuring all these costs and all this revenue to determine the contribution margin that we just spoke about, but doing it on a per unit basis, right? A unit could be a sale of a product in e-commerce. A unit would be every order that gets shipped out. In a subscription business, the unit is the recurring subscription. So those are just some examples. Now, we're going to walk through a pretty quick, simple example of an online shoe retailer, right? And let's say this online shoe retailer sells 100 pairs of shoes, right? And here's that P&L that we saw before. It had the revenue section, then it has the cost of goods, and then the gross profit, right? So this easy example, they generate $4,250 from sales after discounts. Their net revenue is $3,750. Subtract the $2,350 cost of goods sold, which are the shoe manufacturing costs and the packaging costs, and that's gross profit right here. And again, this is what we saw on the first slide of the presentation, where the finance folks are more focused on that gross profit. Now we're looking at what happens when we take these revenues, costs, and we divide them by the 100 pairs of shoes sold. Remember, we said unit economics is solving this down to the per unit measurement, right? And so here we've divided, we did very easy math, 100 pairs of shoes, so everything is divided by 100, and now you can see it really means that the average shoe is priced at $4,250, but they give blended discounts of $5, so they're they're selling them for $3,750. After these costs of goods sold, which are $23.50 per order, they end up making $14 per shoe. But as you see, this is not the unit economics that the operators should be looking at. And that's because this does not include the variable cost, right? So I'm going to take you to the next slide. And now you notice I introduced the word fully loaded here, right? This is what we said. Now is where we're going to take in all of the costs and we're going to bring them up above the line. So we're going to take in these variable costs and we're going to add this whole section here. So right after gross profit, we've added this whole variable cost section that then gets us to contribution margin. You may notice that in this example, we've done a little bit more than that. In the revenue section, whereas before the revenue was shoes sold at discounts, now we've also added returns. In the cost of goods sold, not just the shoe manufacturing cost, but shipping and packaging, but we've also added damages from the factory cost. This is just to illustrate that not only do you need to bring up the indirect variable costs above the line, but there may be some other things that one is omitting and not realizing that they should be counted, right? Because maybe in the example of damages from factory costs, maybe the first 3 months that you operate, there's no damages from the factory costs. And then all of a sudden 1 month you get damages. And in this business world, we should be accruing and taking into effect the probability that there are going to be some damages, right? So that's just the idea that sometimes we forget about some things, right? But the very important thing is really the taking into consideration of now these variable costs, right? And I think now is a good time to take a moment and maybe talk a little bit about variable costs, the indirect variable costs, and why they're different than the actual cost of sales and how they're similar or the same, right? So if you think about the shoe example, when you're shipping a shoe, you have to produce a shoe, right? So there's that cost of the shoe being produced in the factory. That cost has to happen when the shoe is sold. The same thing as shipping and packaging. If the shoe is shipped, that cost will happen. You notice in indirect variable costs, we put in customer service support hourly staff. What does this mean? Well, if you think about this intuitively, the more you sell, the more probability that a customer has an issue and has to call customer support, right? So this is one of the more trivial indirect variable costs, which most operators already have on their P&Ls above the line. But it's the idea that the more you sell, the more customer support, but it doesn't scale linearly. It doesn't mean I sell 100 more orders, now I have to have one more person for customer support. And generally it scales in step functions, right? Because you can't hire a new customer support person for an hour a week. You have to hire kind of in these incremental steps of either full-time employees or part-time employees, and a savvy operator can then flex the hourly salaries or salary employees to sort of optimize this. But again, customer support, this is a cost that is not directly associated with every sale, but it is a cost that will go up as your volume goes up. It just doesn't go up linearly, and it will generally go up as a step function, right? I also put warehouse and storage fees here. An example of this is right now you have a small warehouse and you have a rent of X. And so your unit economics of having that warehouse are the rent of the warehouse divided by what you sell, right? If I now double my production and I'm still using the same warehouse, I'm still paying the same in my fees, but now on a unitary basis, that actually went down. But there's going to come a point where that warehouse is no good for us anymore, and we need to get into that bigger warehouse. And now, again, we're going to have that step function jump, right? So, again, these are indirect variable costs because they're not a cost that happens for every single item you sell, but they are costs that will go up over time as you grow. So now, let's go back to this example. And we now have fully loaded these unit economics, as we like to say, and the company is losing $50 contribution margin, where on a true units basis, now we're looking at the operator's P&L. We've divided that operator's P&L by 100 units sold. We're actually losing 50 cents per shoe or per order.
So Esteban, big difference, no? And if we weren't doing this analysis correctly, basically, uh, an operator could have the assumption that they're making $14 per order, but really, when you bring all these other costs above the line, or you fully load them into the analysis, all of a sudden we have a completely different picture, right? Like this company, basically, every single order or pair of shoes they sell, they're losing money.
Exactly. And again, that's something where let's look at the warehouse and storage fees, for example, right? Those fees are $1 right now on a per unit basis. If we can double our production and not have to move to a different warehouse, that warehouse and storage on a per shoe basis gets cut in half from $1 to 50 cents. And now they're break even, right? So that's one of these unit economics margin costs that's going to solve itself naturally with growth. But again, we need to remember that there'll be a tipping point where you now have to get into a bigger warehouse or at a secondary warehouse, etc. And if you think about an Amazon, right, they're adding warehouses and warehouses. For them, these warehouses and bits and pieces of their supply chain are almost variable costs that are constantly on the rise, right? But they're doing it, they're being very efficient, and they're scaling them in ways where they get more and more efficiencies over time, right?
The important thing right now is like, okay, now we have a clear diagnosis of what's happening on a per unit basis in this company that we didn't before. And myself, having done this, probably hundreds of times with different founders, and you as well, wouldn't you say the part that I keep on seeing being the major problem is always being able to properly identify what are all those costs? Because I've never had a founder present to me their unit economics and not have stuff missing from it. No, so like, what do you recommend there? Like when you go down to P&L, like a detailed P&L, line by line, like how do you ask yourself, does this belong above the line? Yes or no?
To answer your question, Juan, which is how do you know what's above the line, what's below the line? You really almost start from thinking, hey, this cost is fixed, but for how long? And is it fixed forever? And that's really, in a way, what determines your horizon, right? So in terms of this customer support hourly that we put in our variable costs, right? The reality is when you get large enough, you're now layering in managers and directors of customer service, right? And as that happens, those are these new step functions. But let's say for the next 2 years, we can operate without having to increase managerial staff. Then that managerial staff is still a fixed cost, right? But the day that as you grow, you need to layer more managers in customer service, now those managers should live above the line. I don't know if that makes sense or answer the question.
Yeah, and I think it's always a nuanced situation, right? When you're doing this analysis, very business model by business model, and I think what we've seen also over the years is two things, right? There's either the founders or operators that just don't know how to do the analysis properly. So by accident, they leave stuff below the line. But then I've also seen, in the last 6, 7 years, founders that maybe do know what the real unit economics are, but they tend to kind of like, on decks, on pitch decks, when they're raising money, they tend to kind of make the optics look better by having some of these things below the line per se. And and by doing so, basically, you know, telling others that their unit economic contribution margin is higher than it really is. And it's just a game that's played, right?
Yeah. No, and you hit it on the nose because it makes sense from an incentive standpoint why operators might broadcast externally more favorable unit economics, especially in in the fundraising circuit world. But what makes absolutely no sense at all is for operators to be misrepresenting their unit economics internally, right? And it's a combination of not knowing and sometimes just choosing to omit things. I've heard operators say, well, let's assume that cost as if it were at scale. Well, that's a pretty large assumption, right? Because generally in these startup worlds, you have cash constraints and operational constraints, so you can't just assume that you'll get to scale, right? Getting to scale is part of the challenge. So that's really the big things, and that's why in these slides we did, and I'm going to go back for a second. That's why we didn't just add the variable cost piece, but we also added some specific line items inside of the costs that were already on this P&L to illustrate the fact that there are things that you might not think about, but that really should be factored into your unit economics.
I would say almost always that happens, right? I mean, that happened when we met, when you came on board as head of finance at Washio, similar story, right? And I think that happens to me all the time. The more you dig, the more you discover that there's new costs, maybe not today, maybe they'll be there tomorrow. And it's kind of like an onion, right? Like you peel out these layers and until you get to and even then, sometimes I feel like, you finish this exercise and then X weeks later you realize that you left something out, something that you didn't think of. But with this said, I wanna kind of send a message that, what we're trying to do is try to educate as many founders and operators as possible with this series of video clinic and what we're going to do in future episodes, but also, kind of say this isn't what we're saying here isn't you have to build a business model that immediately has to have a focus on positive unit economics. I think it's very nuanced in the world of startups because there are startups that do have that liberty by access of funding, unlimited funding almost, to not have to worry on that right away and kind of go after this, when we scale, we'll figure it out play. But the reality is that's probably less than 1% of startups or companies that have that privilege. So for any other startup, what we're saying here isn't, hey, if your contribution margin is negative, close up shop and give up. No, it's more you got to be aware of the current situation and you have to have a credible path to profitability.
Juan just brought up a very important point, which is, we these operators are in essence losing 50 cents per every order placed, right? Should they close shop? No, they shouldn't, right? Because let's assume that they have their customer service staff, but the reality is they're at half capacity, so they could handle twice as many emails or phone calls or whatever, right? So that means if this company doubles its volume, automatically that customer support per shoe goes down to $1, and now they're making 50 cents a shoe, right? So some things will resolve themselves automatically, right, with scale, but some things won't. And actually, this is a perfect segue, so we can talk a little bit about margin improvements, and that's what's next after you've gotten to this
Diagnosis.
full true units and diagnosis, right? So now that this brings up the perfect time to talk about margin improvements, right? Once you've arrived at your diagnosis and know what your true unit economics are and are able to measure it, you have to figure out what action can I take, right? And in this example where the company right now is losing 50 cents per order, what do they need to do to make money on each order? Make 50 cents more than they are today, right? So they need to, somewhere in these unit economics, They need to shave off 50 cents from the manufacturing cost of $16 or 50 cents from the damage cost. Somewhere they need to improve that unitary measure by 50 cents, right? And in this example, we're gonna say, okay, let's think about a single margin improvement where all they do is start discounting less, right? They're a little bit more mindful of their sales and promos. So if they're able to bring their discounts of $5 per order, which is 11.8%, down to only $4.25 per order, or 10%, now they would instantly be making 25 cents per shoe. And here you can see that example, right? Everything else is exactly the same except the discounts per shoe from $5, 11.8%, down to $4.25, 10%. And that 75 cents flows all the way to the bottom, so that instead of losing 50 cents per order, we're now making 25 cents per order, right? It doesn't seem like a lot. It doesn't seem like a tremendous improvement, but this is just one margin initiative, right? So in reality, once you've constructed this unit economics, you'd actually start thinking about multiple margin initiatives, right? What can we do, to help there be less returns? What can we do, as we scale, we can get manufacturing down. If we're better at applying pressure on our supply chain, there's going to be less damages per shoe, right? So there's a slew of things that you can do, and in essence, this is a quick little thing about this is you develop these unit economics. You now know the things that need to change, and some things can and some things can't. And even better, now you can determine who can influence those, right? So the unit economics ends up being a starting point for your blueprint of how to fix operations in a way. So now that this company is making $5 per shoe, right? If the company has a fixed cost of $50,000 a month, let's say, whether it's rent, salaries, office expenses, how many orders do they need to fulfill to be cash flow positive, right? It's easy math.
Mm.
$5 per shoe, 50,000 fixed cost. They only need to sell 10,000 orders to be profitable. I said only. Maybe $10,000. Maybe 10,000 orders per month is a lot, right? So this company then has decisions to make.
Uber important for all founders and operators to understand. If they're negative and it matters right now, they need to create a path to profitability. And another thing to note here, that for me, not coming from a finance world and coming strictly from being an operator, something that helped me immensely. And like, I almost don't even like to look at a P&L or any type of report without the percentages column. Because for me, in absolute numbers, sometimes trends can be lost. Whereas if you have the percentages there, you can catch those trends easier. You can see, hey, customer support in April was 4% and in May it jumped to 7%. What happened? And sometimes those are things that you miss if the percentages are not there. But anyways, it's a little bit of my personal preference as an operator, and something that I tell people again and again. But I think in general, you guys get the idea. You guys get why this is so important. But this gets a lot more complex than what we talked about today, right, Esteban? Because something that we didn't cover is what about customer acquisition costs? Like, where does that go? And what about if it's a subscription model, or like, there's just so many nuances within the world of unit economic analysis, and that's kind of the idea why we want to make this a multi-video series, so we can kind of dig a little deeper into different models. To be completely honest with you guys, this is something me and Esteban talk about. This is something that we like to, dig into, what the unit economics of different business models are, what the unit economics of Uber are, what are the unit economics of these scooter companies. And so we wanted to, instead of having to fly to an accelerator and give a clinic on unit economics, we wanted to make all these resources available for any founder and operator around the world to be able to have access to them, and hopefully, for this to spread and for more operators to do a proper contribution margin unit economic analysis.
Absolutely, Juan. And again, I'm glad you brought up customer acquisition costs, because companies nowadays, especially with VC funding, it's very easy to just throw dollars and dollars on spend to drive revenue, right? And if spend drives revenue, and if spend is correlated with revenue, then clearly it's an indirect variable cost, right? So based on what we spoke about earlier, almost marketing dollars should be above the line. especially if they drive acquisition, right? It's a different thing, the marketing dollars that you spend on your PR team, right? Money, because that's a fixed cost, right? That branding piece. But anything that's incremental to drive more views, more potential consumers is clearly an indirect variable cost, right?
Yeah, yeah, and how you deal with that customer acquisition cost also varies depending on your business model, right? It's totally different a business model where I sell one product to a user one time and he'll never buy anything from me again versus the model that has a high acquisition cost but is recurring. So there's a lot to dig into. I don't know if I mean, is there? I think the idea for this particular first video, Esteban, was for it to be very one-on-one, for it to be very basic, for us to kind of start showing how this proper analysis is done. Because, to be honest, when we started talking about this and giving clinics and kind of like teaching other founders and operators, it wasn't yet in like, I hate to use this word, but it wasn't yet in vogue within the startup ecosystem. I think just in the last 2 to 3 years, it started to become more of a reality that founders are facing, right? Where now it's not just growth at all cost. It's not just, it's not all these things. Now it's, yes, the VC scale model, the growth component and velocity is super important, but you also have to go into this with unit economics that makes sense at scale.
Yeah, exactly. No, and again, I think the goal for what you've been listening to and watching, and what would make us very happy that you take away, is just an understanding that not all operators have their unit economics down. Some of them even know that they don't have them down, and that's the biggest worry that Juan and I have when we watch operators, when we try to help operators, is them essentially flying blind, making decisions off of numbers that don't take into account everything that's happening.
Hopefully by the end of this series, and we don't know if it's going to be 3 or if it's going to be 8 or if it's going to be 10, but hopefully you guys enjoy it. Hopefully it's valuable. And hopefully by the end of the series, anyone that digs into this as an operator has a way better understanding about unit economics, a way better understanding about his own business model and the levers that impact that business model.
Yeah, absolutely. And we definitely look forward to sharing more. We'll even tell you a little bit more about our own war stories together, and a little bit of that. So until next time, this has been the Margin Medics.